Hello, and welcome to Devlog number 16. Before I get started with the changes from this sprint, I want to announce that we're going to be putting up a public development roadmap on our road to early access for everyone to see on Trello. The link to that is going to be in the description, and basically what it is a list of all the features that we think are mandatory for us to finish before we can go into early access. And then there's also a list of future major updates that we want to do once we have released an early access, leading up to a full release of the game. And one more announcement is that we are in the market for a few more testers, maybe 2 or 3. I do give preference to Patreon supporters as a thank you for your supporting the project, but anyone can be a tester, so if you are interested, please DM me on Discord and we'll talk about it. So last night we did a 2v3 8,000 point per team battle, which should, I think, be the largest fight that we've ever done. It was a lot of fun. That's the footage that you're seeing in the background for most of this video. Unfortunately, we did have one of the players crash about halfway through on the 3-player team, but overall it was actually a pretty bug-free fight, and that was the only major issue that we encountered. Now, in the last video I mentioned that the problem with the all-missile meta that had developed was actually rooted in the fact that electronic warfare was overpowered rather than missiles being overpowered. The major issue there being that you could jam indefinitely and constantly scramble the enemy's sensors, so they would have no idea where you are to counterattack, and their point defenses would be unable to get a good lock so that they could shoot down the tiny targets that are the missiles. With that in mind, I implemented a number of changes to how EW works. The first is to limit the effectiveness on the attacker's side, and the other is to give the defender a new counter. On the attacker's side, EW weapons now have a cycle timer so that you can't just jam an area indefinitely. With that change, and based on feedback from testers, the EW weapons are now a single shot per order. So when you issue an order to shoot EW at an area or a target, it will complete a full cycle at that target, and then it will complete the order and stop, because testers were reporting that they were forgetting that they had targeted EW until it turned back on, and so now it's just a single shot instance. And on the defender side, there's now what I'm calling a burn-through sweep, which is a single ping of the radar at a much increased power level so that it's more likely that that return will be greater than the jamming power. So you'll get a single fixed contact, unmoving, knowing where the enemy is, so hopefully you can try to get a fire control lock before that ping expires, which is more resistant to jamming. But the burn-through sweep comes with a trade-off in that there's a percentage chance that every time you trigger it, the sensor will damage itself a little bit. With these changes, you now have to be a lot more deliberate in your use of EW, picking the optimal time to use it so that you have it ready when you actually need it. The mechanical reason for the time limits on EW is obvious, but the narrative reason is so that you don't burn out the amplifiers. But there are some situations where you want to sacrifice your equipment in order to save your ship. If your ship is about to be destroyed unless you jam right now, it doesn't make any sense to try to preserve your amplifiers. And so in the bottom bar, you'll notice there's now a 5th button, and that's the battle short. And so what the battle short does is it allows you to take the safeties off and run the equipment until it destroys itself. So when battle short is on, the EW weapons will fire indefinitely, but they'll have a chance of damaging themselves every second that they're running beyond their normal cycle length. Another step on my quest to cut down on the optimality of missile-only loadouts was the necessity of making it so that guns were much more effective. I could have done that by just upping the damage values that guns did, but I decided on a different approach, which was reworking the damage model to make it much more interesting. I changed both how armor and component damage is calculated. For armor now has a thickness value rather than a hit point value, and munitions have an armor piercing value. The interesting thing about doing it this way is that shots coming in from oblique angles now experience increased armor thickness because of that angle. The thing that made it really slow to kill targets with guns was actually the way that I made it so that guns could actually kill targets at all. If you remember back to one of the previous devlogs, I mentioned that a problem with guns in the initial implementation was that modules would block each other. If they were destroyed, only the first one would get damage applied to it, and it would protect other modules behind it. So what I did was I spread the damage out across all the modules that the ray went through. The unintended side effect of this was that destroyed modules would eat up damage that should have been going into functional modules. Also, HE versus AP ammo really functioned exactly the same, it's just that one did more armor damage and one did more component damage. So I've changed it now so that they have completely different behaviors when it comes to damaging components. Armor-piercing rounds will cast a ray through the ship as they did before, but instead of spreading their damage, they'll do all of their damage to the first non-destroyed module that ray encounters. But on the other hand, if the round over-penetrates and comes out the other side, it will spread its damage evenly across all the modules that ray encountered. HE rounds, on the other hand, will travel either a set distance into the hull and then explode, or explode on the first component that they hit. When they explode, they have an explosion radius that will do damage to any modules that are in that radius. With these changes, guns are a lot more effective at disabling targets within a reasonable amount of time, and missiles are no longer the only option for getting a kill. Previously, if you had a single frigate versus a single frigate with guns only, it could take 20 to 30 minutes for that battle to end. But now, you can disable a frigate with another frigate's guns in about 2 to 3, maybe max 5 minutes. With a fleet of ships with guns firing, that goes a lot quicker. One of the things that was really sad to me was that I put a bunch of work into the point defense missiles that would fly out and shoot down other missiles, but no one was really using them because you had to target them manually. So I finally got around to making it so that the point defense missiles will fire automatically at the top 5 threats coming for the ship. And what you're seeing in the background is these point defense missiles going out to target the swarm of enemy missiles that are currently being launched. And then you're also seeing the reactor of the enemy scout corvette go critical that I accidentally drove my cruiser too close to. Coming up in the next sprint, first is going to be the last part of the EW balance, which is jamming acclimation. So the longer that you are jamming a target, the more capable they are of rooting out your signal and negating your jamming entirely. So that will provide another incentive to hold off on jamming until you absolutely really need it, but when you can use it, it's going to be most effective. There's also really a desperate need for some fleet management tools, because right now the fleet list is just a list of items. You can't remove or delete anything. If you want to delete a fleet, you have to actually go into the file explorer and delete it. So I have a ton of fleets that I just don't need anymore that I need to remove. So it's something that's seriously lacking right now. I also want to do an overhaul of at least the skirmish game UI, maybe all the UI if I get time to do it. Right now the UI is very dev, for lack of a better word. There's not a lot of coherent graphic design to it. There's a lot of missing information, such as it shows you the status of all of your modules in that display in the center, but it's not really that useful. So seeing what the status of your weapons are is what you really care about, and your sensors. So a UI that shows that much more coherently along with the mode selections. I also want the graphic design to look a lot different. I think that the sensors view or the tactical view is very diegetic, and I really like the look of it. I want the rest of the UI to match that. I want it to look like you're sitting in an operations console, so that's the look that I'm going to be going for with it. And we're also missing a lot of key multiplayer features, like for example, player communication like chat. A pinging system would be really useful to be able to communicate to teammates, look here, if you don't have voice comms, or even to supplement voice comms. There's also a lot of polishing necessary with it. For example, we didn't even know that one of the players had crashed until we finished the game and they told us that he had crashed. So notifications like that, what happens to the ships owned by a player that drops? Do they go to their teammates? Does an AI start controlling them? That kind of thing. And then adding some really basic features I've been missing, like passwords for multiplayer lobbies and that kind of stuff. So with that, that is my update. Please join us on our Discord, wishlist the game on Steam if you haven't already. It helps us out a lot. And I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.